People didn't avoid the land because it was cursed. They avoided it because nothing ever stayed quiet there for long. It sat beyond the last maintained road, past the point where mailboxes stopped and neighbors stopped asking questions. The fields looked ordinary at first glance, flat, open, unremarkable. But anyone who had lived nearby long enough knew the truth. Sound behaved differently there. Wind carried farther. Nights felt heavier, and every few years someone tried to use the land and quietly gave up. No arguments, no explanations, they just left. So when a war veteran bought it, people noticed. Not because they cared what he did with his money, but because they couldn't understand why a man like him would choose a place like that. He wasn't young. He wasn't desperate. He didn't need to prove anything. Most men his age were downsizing, moving closer to town, choosing comfort over distance. He did the opposite. He arrived alone, paid in full, and didn't ask for opinions. The house was old but solid. The land was open, and the tree line at the far edge of the property stood like it always had, dense, uninviting, and silent. At first, people assumed he wanted peace. That assumption didn't last. The veteran didn't behave like a man seeking quiet. He walked the land methodically, always at the same hours, always watching more than he touched. He listened, not the way curious men listen, but the way experienced men do, patiently, without expectation. Neighbors noticed small things, the way he stopped sometimes, as if measuring distance by sound, the way he marked certain spots and ignored others, the way he never approached the trees directly but never turned his back to them either. No one asked him about it. Men who've lived long enough learn when questions aren't welcome. As weeks passed, the veteran made practical improvements, fences, basic repairs. Nothing flashy, nothing that suggested fear. If anything, his calm made people more uneasy, because men who are afraid tend to rush. He never did. One evening, as the sun dropped and the land slipped into shadow, a sound carried across the fields. Low, rhythmic, distant enough to be mistaken for something else. Most people wouldn't have noticed it at all. The veteran did. He stopped walking, not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply stood still, head slightly turned, listening the way he once had in places far removed from farms and fences. The sound came again. Steady, measured, intentional. He didn't need anyone to explain it. He recognized the pattern immediately. That night he didn't turn on lights. He didn't move closer to investigate. And he didn't tell anyone what he had heard. Because some sounds aren't meant to be questioned. They're meant to be understood. And whatever had just announced itself out there wasn't random. It was a message. The next morning, the veteran drove into town as if nothing had happened. That alone unsettled people. Men who'd heard strange things at night, things they couldn't explain, usually came in talking fast, trying to borrow courage from other voices. They'd mention it like a joke, even when it wasn't funny, because jokes made the unknown feel smaller. The veteran didn't do that. He parked, bought what he needed, nodded at the clerk and left with the same steady pace he'd had since the day he arrived. No questions, no hints, no attempt to recruit anyone's opinion. Still, people noticed the small changes. The way he looked over his shoulder once while loading feed. The way he paused in the parking lot, not searching, not startled, just listening to the wind as if it carried information. By midday, the usual talk started up at the hardware store. "Something's off about that place," one man said, keeping his voice low as if the land could hear him from miles away. Another shrugged. "That land's always been off. That's why it's cheap." A third man, older, said nothing at first. He stared at a rack of nails like he was reading a memory he didn't want to. Finally, he spoke. "Some places don't want to be owned. They want to be respected." Nobody laughed at that. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because every man there understood the point. Not everything needed a deed to matter. The veteran didn't hear that conversation, but he didn't need to. Back on the farm, he walked the boundary again, this time slower and wider. He didn't carry a rifle. He didn't carry anything that would turn a quiet situation into a loud one. Only a flashlight he never turned on and a small notebook he barely used. He followed the fence line until the ground rose slightly, then fell away into a shallow cut in the terrain, a natural drainage that ran toward the trees. The previous owner had ignored it. The veteran studied it. Wind, he'd learned, loves straight lines. It gains confidence in open space. It becomes bold when there's nothing to interrupt it. So do people. He stepped into the shallow cut and felt the change immediately. Not warmth, not comfort, but a reduction. Less wind in his ears, less bite on his face. The land itself was offering a lesson, the same one it had offered for decades. Interrupt force. Change the shape. Don't fight what you can redirect. He climbed out and looked toward the tree line. It wasn't far. A few hundred yards, maybe. In daylight, it looked ordinary. A dense wall of trunks and branches, black in some places where the shadows were thick. But the trees weren't what held his attention. It was the space in front of them. The ground there was flatter, smoother, as if people had avoided walking too close, leaving the edge undisturbed. It didn't look like a path. It looked like a decision that had been made over time. That's when the veteran felt it again. Not fear, but clarity. The sound from the night before hadn't been a celebration. It hadn't been random noise carried by wind. It had been measured, repeated. A rhythm meant to travel. A message designed to be understood by the right ears. He had heard many messages like that in his life. Some spoken, some implied, some delivered through silence. And the most dangerous ones weren't the loud threats. The most dangerous were the warnings you ignored because they weren't meant for you. Until they were. He walked back to the house and went inside without looking over his shoulder. That evening, he ate simply, cleaned up, and turned off the lights early. He didn't sit by a window. He didn't watch the tree line like a man in a movie. He waited like a man who understood that attention can be a mistake. Night arrived the way it always did on open land, fast and complete. The last color drained from the sky, leaving the farm wrapped in deep blue and black. Wind moved across the field with a soft, constant hiss, and the house settled into its own quiet creaks. Then, just past midnight, the sound returned. Low, rhythmic, unmistakable once you recognized it. The veteran didn't move at first. He didn't sit up quickly. He didn't reach for anything. He listened. The rhythm came again, more consistent now, not closer, not farther. Like it was being played from the same position as before, at the same distance, with the same intent. This wasn't someone drifting through the night. This was someone staying put, holding ground. He rose and moved carefully through the dark house. Not stealthy, just controlled. He stopped near the front window, keeping the room behind him black so his outline wouldn't glow in the glass. He didn't see torches. He didn't see fires. He didn't see faces. But he saw something else. Something most men would miss unless they'd trained their mind to notice it. A change in the field. Where the moonlight fell, the grass moved unevenly near the tree line. Not like wind. Wind moves broadly, like water. This movement was broken and brief, as if something had stepped and then stopped. The veteran didn't interpret it as an attack. He interpreted it as confirmation. The message wasn't meant to scare him into leaving. It was meant to establish a truth. You are here now. We know it. And the land is not empty. He stepped back from the window and waited again. After several minutes, the drumming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means peace. Sometimes it means patience. And sometimes it means you are being watched by people who don't need to announce themselves twice. The veteran sat at the kitchen table until the sky began to lighten. He didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, but because he was working. Not with tools. With memory. He thought back to the kinds of boundaries that never appeared on maps. The kinds of claims that weren't legal but were enforced anyway. The kinds of territory that men respected not because they were told to, but because they learned what happened when they didn't. And as the first weak morning light touched the field, He understood what the next decision had to be. If he treated this like a problem to be solved, he would make it worse. If he treated it like a message to be respected, he might have a chance to live there without turning the land into a battlefield. Most men, when they hear a warning, take it personally. A veteran learns something different. Warnings aren't always about you. Sometimes they're about order. That afternoon, he drove into town again, not to talk, not to ask for help, but to gather information the way you always should, quietly and without announcing why you need it. At the diner, he sat alone near the end, back to the wall, eyes on the room out of habit more than fear. He ordered coffee, listened to the low hum of conversations, and waited. Eventually, an older man approached, someone with a face carved by weather and time. He didn't sit down. He didn't smile. "You bought that place," the man said. The veteran nodded once. The man's eyes held no accusation, only a kind of tired certainty. "Then you heard it." The veteran didn't pretend otherwise. "I did." A pause. A glance toward the window, as if the land itself was visible from there. "That sound isn't for everybody," the man said quietly. "But if you heard it, it was for you." The veteran held the man's gaze. "What does it mean?" The older man's jaw tightened slightly, like he was weighing the cost of saying anything at all. "It means," he said, "you're standing on someone's line." And then, without offering comfort or detail, he walked away. The veteran finished his coffee, left a tip, and stepped outside into the cold air. The sky was clear. The day looked harmless. But the rhythm from the night still sat in his chest, like an echo. He drove back to the farm knowing one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. It was beginning. And now that he'd recognized the drums, the land was waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be. The land didn't change after that conversation in town. That was the unsettling part. No broken fences, no trampled fields, no visible signs of confrontation. If anything, the farm looked calmer than before, as if it were holding its breath. Men who've lived long enough know this truth. Real danger rarely announces itself with chaos. It announces itself with order. The veteran understood that immediately. He spent the next 2 days doing nothing that could be mistaken for a challenge. No clearing near the tree line. No walking past dusk. No changes that altered the shape of the land in a way someone else might read as expansion. Instead, he observed, at dawn, he walked the same route every morning, stopping at the same points, listening to the same sounds. Wind direction, bird movement, the way the grass leaned differently near the trees, even when the rest of the field lay still. By the third morning, he noticed something new. Tracks. They weren't fresh enough to be obvious to anyone looking for footprints. They weren't careless. They followed the same shallow depressions in the earth, places where the ground naturally dipped and massed weight. Whoever had made them understood terrain. That mattered. The veteran crouched low, not to inspect closely, but to confirm what his mind already suspected. The spacing was deliberate, not hurried, not exploratory. This wasn't trespassing. This was patrol. He stood and looked toward the tree line again. In daylight, it revealed nothing. Just trunks, branches, shadows layered over shadows. But the tracks didn't reach the house. They stopped well short of it, forming an invisible boundary that curved gently across the land. A line, not marked with signs, not enforced with threats, but respected. That afternoon, the veteran did something most people would consider backward. He didn't reinforce the fence near the trees. He moved it back, only by a few yards, just enough to make the adjustment obvious to anyone paying attention. He didn't leave tools behind. He didn't make noise about it. He simply acknowledged the boundary without saying a word. That night, there were no drums. The silence felt deliberate, not peaceful, but observant. The veteran slept lightly, waking several times without reason, the way soldiers do long after war's end. Each time, he listened. Each time, the land remained quiet. By morning, he was certain of one thing. The message had been received. That should have been the end of it. It never is. The problem wasn't the land. The problem was people who didn't understand it. 2 days later, a truck pulled up just after noon. The veteran saw it from the porch before the engine even cut off. Newer model. City plates. Not lost. Curious. 2 men stepped out. Younger. Confident in the careless way men are when they believe the world exists to accommodate them. One of them looked around and smiled. "Didn't expect it to be this empty," he said, loud enough for the veteran to hear. The other laughed. "That's why it's perfect." The veteran didn't greet them right away. He waited, watching how they moved. They didn't look toward the tree line. They didn't scan the land. Their attention stayed shallow, on the house, the fence, the open space. They were thinking in terms of ownership, not territory. When the veteran finally stepped forward, they seemed surprised, like they'd forgotten the land belonged to someone. "We're just looking," one of them said quickly. "Heard this place was abandoned." "It isn't," the veteran replied calmly. They exchanged a glance. The smile faded slightly, replaced by something defensive. "You hear the stories?" the other man asked, trying to sound amused. "About this land?" The veteran nodded. "I've heard some." "You believe them?" The veteran didn't answer right away. He looked past them, toward the tree line, then back again. "Belief isn't required," he said. "Awareness is." They laughed again, but this time it was forced. "We were thinking about camping out by the trees," one of them said. "Just for a night or two. No harm done." The veteran's tone didn't change. "You won't." Something about the certainty in his voice finally reached them. "You threatening us?" one asked. "No," the veteran said. "I'm advising you." They stood there a moment longer, measuring him. Older, alone. No visible weapon, no raised voice. Finally, one of them shrugged. "Whatever. This place gives me the creeps anyway." They got back in the truck and drove off, tires kicking dust that settled slowly back into the grass. The veteran didn't feel relief. He felt concern. Because those men had been careless, but not malicious. And careless people attract attention. That night, the drums returned. Closer this time. Not loud, not urgent, but nearer than before. The veteran stood on the porch, hands resting loosely at his sides, listening. The rhythm was slower now, more deliberate, less of a warning, more of a question. He didn't step forward. He didn't step back. He stayed exactly where he was. Minutes passed, then more. The drums continued, steady and patient, until finally they stopped again. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. The next morning he found something new near the fence line. Not damage, an object. Simple, hand-carved, placed carefully at the edge of the adjusted boundary. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't decorative. It was symbolic. The veteran picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The carving wasn't crude. It was precise, worn smooth by time or practice. A marker, not a warning, a recognition. He set it back exactly where he'd found it. Later that day, the older man from the diner returned, this time pulling into the driveway without hesitation. "You did the right thing," the man said, not bothering with greetings. The veteran nodded. So did they. The man's eyes flicked toward the tree line. Most people don't know how to listen anymore. The veteran held the marker loosely in his hand. "Listening keeps things quiet." "For now," the man said. They stood in silence a moment, both men understanding that quiet wasn't the same as safety. "What happens next?" the veteran asked. The older man exhaled slowly. "Next comes the test." The veteran looked at the land. Open, calm, deceptively peaceful. "What kind?" The man met his eyes. The kind that tells them whether you're a neighbor or a problem. As the truck disappeared down the road, the veteran remained where he was, the marker heavy in his palm. He had survived worse tests than this, but those had been fought with uniforms and clear rules. This one would be different. This one would be fought with restraint. And restraint, he knew, was something very few men truly understood. The test didn't come from the trees. That surprised the veteran. Men with experience expect danger to arrive from the direction they've been warned about. They prepare for the obvious angle. They brace for the front line. The real problems almost always come from behind. It began with trucks, not one, 3. They arrived just after sunrise 2 mornings later, engines loud and careless in the quiet air. Dust rolled across the field in thick sheets, settling on grass that had known nothing but wind for years. The veteran stood on the porch and watched. The men who stepped out weren't curious like the first pair. They were confident, purposeful. The kind of confidence built on paperwork and permission, not understanding. Surveyors. He recognized the equipment immediately. Stakes, measuring wheels, bright flags meant to mark land as if land were a simple thing. One of the men raised a hand in greeting, already smiling. "Morning," he called out. "County contract." The veteran walked down slowly, stopping well short of the fence. He didn't cross the adjusted boundary. He stayed exactly where he had chosen to stand. "What's being surveyed?" he asked. "Future access road," the man said easily. "Development further east. This land's part of the route." The veteran's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That route doesn't exist," he said. The man shrugged. "It will." Behind them, stakes began going into the ground, bright orange, aggressively visible. Each one felt like a shout in a place that demanded quiet. The veteran turned his head slightly toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but the air felt wrong. "You should stop," the veteran said calmly. The man laughed, assuming posturing. "Sir, we have permits." "Permits don't change boundaries," the veteran replied. That earned him a look, not hostile, dismissive. "We'll be done by sundown." They didn't notice the birds leaving. The veteran did. By noon, the land felt unsettled. The wind shifted constantly, directionless. Sound carried too far. A dropped tool echoed longer than it should have. The veteran approached the crew once more. "You need to pull the stakes closest to the trees," he said. "Today." The crew leader frowned. "That's not your call." The veteran held his gaze. "It's not yours either." The man sighed. "We're not here to debate folklore." The veteran didn't argue. He turned and walked away. That was when the first drum sounded. It wasn't distant this time. It came from the tree line, deep, resonant, unmistakable. One beat, then another. The crew froze. Someone laughed nervously. "That part of the job description?" The second drum joined in, then a third. The rhythm wasn't fast. It wasn't chaotic. It was synchronized. The veteran didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He waited. The sound rolled across the field, heavier than before, closer. This wasn't a message meant for one man anymore. This was a declaration. The crew leader's smile vanished. "Who's out there?" he shouted, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. No answer came. The drums continued. Then the fire appeared. Not flames leaping high, but controlled light. 3 points, spaced evenly along the tree line. Too deliberate to be coincidence. Too restrained to be threat. Territory. The veteran stepped forward, placing himself between the crew and the land. "You need to leave," he said. One of the men reached for his phone. "This is harassment." "No," the veteran replied. "This is correction." The ground beneath one of the stakes shifted, just slightly, enough for the flag to lean. The crew didn't wait for more. Engines roared to life. Tools were abandoned. Stakes were yanked from the ground in a rush that bordered on panic. Trucks reversed awkwardly, tires spinning. The drum stopped the moment the last vehicle crossed back onto the road. The silence afterward was absolute. The veteran stood alone in the field, heart steady, breath controlled. He hadn't chosen a side. He had enforced a line. That night, the older man from town arrived again, this time without waiting to be invited. "You didn't fire a shot," the man said, impressed. "I didn't need to," the veteran replied. The man looked toward the tree line where no light remained. "They wanted to know what kind of man you were." "And?" the veteran asked. The man considered. "You didn't escalate. You didn't retreat. You corrected without humiliating." The veteran nodded. "That's how you keep things from turning ugly." The man studied him carefully. "You understand now, don't you?" "Yes," the veteran said. "This land isn't avoided because it's dangerous. It's avoided because it remembers." The older man smiled faintly. "And it remembers men too." They stood in silence as night settled again, quieter now, not empty, but balanced. "What happens next?" the veteran asked. The man took a breath. "Now comes the part most people fail." "What part?" "Living here without needing to win." The veteran looked across the field, the place where stakes had stood only hours earlier, now erased as if they'd never been there. "I didn't come here to win," he said. "I came to stay." The older man nodded once. "Then you might." As he left, the veteran remained outside long after the sky darkened. There were no drums that night, no fire, no movement. Just the wind, steady and clean, moving across land that had finally decided what he was. Not an intruder, not an enemy, but not family either. Something rarer. A man who knew when to stand, and when not to push. And in places like this, that knowledge mattered more than strength. The absence of sound lasted longer than the veteran expected. In places like this, silence is rarely permanent. It's negotiated, maintained, allowed to exist only as long as no one gives it a reason to break. For 3 nights after the surveyors fled, there were no drums, no fires, no movement near the trees. The land settled back into itself, as if a muscle had finally relaxed after being held too long. The veteran didn't mistake that for victory. Victory changes behavior. This changed balance. On the 4th morning, he woke before dawn and walked the boundary again, stopping where the stakes had been. The ground showed no trace. Whoever had returned after the trucks left knew how to erase presence as carefully as they had announced it. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, watching the fog lift. The trees remained still, but the feeling of being observed was gone, not replaced by safety, by acceptance of terms. That afternoon, the older man from town arrived without his truck. He walked. That alone carried meaning. He stopped at the adjusted fence line and waited until the veteran approached. They stood there, separated by a distance that had been carefully chosen. "You passed the test," the older man said. The veteran didn't respond. "The drums weren't a threat," the man continued. "They were a question." "What question?" the veteran asked. The older man looked toward the trees. "Whether you'd listen or force an answer." The veteran nodded. "Most men force answers. And that's why the land empties," the man replied. They walked together toward the shallow cut in the terrain where the wind always softened. The older man stopped there, as if the place itself invited conversation. "People think the drums mean war," he said. "They don't." "What do they mean?" the veteran asked. "They mean memory." The veteran waited. "In the old days," the man said, "drums were used to warn, not attack, to announce presence, to say, 'We are here, and we are paying attention.'" The veteran thought back to the rhythm, measured, controlled, never rushed. "It wasn't meant to scare me into leaving," he said. "No," the older man agreed. "It was meant to see if you'd understand why others did." They stood in silence, the kind that carries weight rather than absence. "The land doesn't reject men," the man continued. "It rejects behavior. The surveyors weren't wrong because they came. They were wrong because they assumed permission replaced respect." The veteran looked across the field, imagining the bright flags again, the noise, the confidence. "They didn't know what they were stepping into," he said. "They didn't care," the man corrected. "That's worse." Later that evening, the veteran sat alone on the porch as the sky darkened. He didn't wait for drums. He waited for himself. There are moments in a man's life where staying becomes harder than leaving. Not because of danger, but because staying requires restraint, the willingness to coexist without control. He understood now why others had abandoned the land, not because it was hostile, but because it refused to be dominated. That night, the drums returned. Only once, a single sequence, brief and unmistakable. The veteran stood and listened, eyes closed. He didn't analyze the rhythm. He didn't search for meaning beyond what was already clear. This wasn't a warning. It was acknowledgement. The next morning, he found another object at the boundary, not a marker this time. Something older, worn smooth by hands and years. A token. He didn't move it. He didn't display it. He left it where it belonged. Days passed, then weeks. The land remained quiet. The fence stayed where he'd moved it. The shallow cut in the terrain became part of his routine, where he paused, where he thought. Occasionally, he noticed signs that told him he wasn't alone in watching. A branch moved where wind hadn't touched it, footprints that never crossed into his space. Lines were being kept. One afternoon, a man from town asked him why he stayed. The veteran considered the question carefully. Because not every place needs to be conquered, he said. Some just need to be understood. The man didn't argue. Winter came later that year, harsher than most. Snow pressed against the fence. Wind cut across the fields with the same confidence it always had, but nothing else came with it. No drums, no fires, no warnings. The land had said what it needed to say. On the coldest night of that winter, the veteran woke briefly to a sound he hadn't heard in months. Not drums, wind moving through trees. Uninterrupted, he slept through the rest of the night. Years later, when people spoke about that land, they spoke differently. Not with fear, with caution, with respect, and always with the same conclusion. It doesn't bother him, they'd say, because he never bothered it. The veteran never corrected them. Some lessons don't need explanation. They need examples. And in a place where others had tried to impose themselves and failed, he had done something quieter and far more difficult. He had learned when to stop pushing. That was what the drums were really meant to do. Not to drive him away, but to find out whether he knew the difference. Time did what it always does. It passed without asking whether anyone was ready. Seasons turned over the land the same way they always had. Grass grew back where tires had once cut into the soil. The fence remained where the veteran had moved it, never creeping forward, never pulled farther back. The tree line stayed dense and unreadable, unchanged by weather or attention. The drums never returned. Not because the land forgot him, but because it no longer needed to speak. The veteran grew older there, slowly, naturally, the way men do when they stop measuring life by urgency. His movements softened, but his awareness never did. He still walked the boundary, still listened more than he spoke, still respected lines that didn't need signs. People stopped asking why he stayed. That question belongs to men who don't understand what it costs to leave. One winter morning, years after the surveyors had fled, a man from town drove out with his son. The boy stared at the open field, the quiet trees, the ordinary-looking land. "This is the place?" he asked. The man nodded. "Yes. Doesn't look dangerous." The veteran heard that from the porch and smiled faintly. "No," he said. "It doesn't." That was the point. The boy looked at him, curious. Did anything ever happen here? The veteran considered the question carefully. He thought about drums in the night, about firelight held just far enough away to matter, about boundaries tested without words. "Yes," he said finally. "Enough." The boy didn't understand. He wasn't meant to. Men don't learn these things all at once. They learn them by watching who survives quietly. As years went on, the land remained avoided by those who didn't belong there, not by force, but by instinct. People sensed what the veteran had learned early on. This wasn't a place that rewarded ambition. It rewarded restraint. On his last winter there, the veteran sat on the porch as snow drifted across the field, the same wind moving the same way it always had. He listened, not for drums, but for balance. The land answered with silence. A good silence. The kind you earn by not pushing when pushing would only prove you don't belong. When he eventually left, on his own terms without urgency, the land stayed as it was. No celebration, no reclaiming, just continuity. And those who passed it afterwards still felt the same thing they always had. Not fear, awareness. Because some places don't need fences or warnings to be protected. They just need one man once who knew when to listen. And that, the land remembered.